All right, welcome back. This week, or I guess I should say last weekend, was crazy to say the least. I don't really know any other word to describe it. A lot of movement in the rankings. 5 of the top 11 teams become defeated. I guess USC was already defeated, but, the other remaining 4 are now defeated with, I think there's only, 8 teams left in the that are undefeated still or something like that.
Yeah, there's 8. Yeah, no, what a weekend for college football. I mean, yeah, we could just start with Alabama and specifically with how they lost to Vandy 40-35. I mean, Vandy up to that point was 0-60 against top 5 ranked opponents, which is absurd. And the fact that they can hold down the fort and beat Alabama is crazy.
Yeah, no, just Vandy is historically known for being bad at football. I think just after watching that game, like the way they won was they came out early, they came out strong, and then whenever Alabama would score, Vandy had an answer, and Bama's defense just couldn't get a stop, and then they ran out of time. And Vandy also had a lot of the possession time. Like their offense had the ball for most of the game compared to Alabama.
Yeah, and also, too, like we talked about Alabama and Jalen Milroe, who was one of the Heisman frontrunners. Now I don't think he is going to be up there after his performance in this game. But the way he's been able to run the ball throughout the season so far, he was limited to just 10 yards on 7 carries, which is crazy. So the fact that Vandy was able to contain him in the pocket and make sure he doesn't get out and break loose for big yards, they did a great job with that. And I think that's what held Alabama from defeating Vandy. And also just in the passing game too, he had 310 yards, which is solid, but 1 touchdown, 1 interception. That's very below standard for Jalen Milroe. And I think because of the performance he had here, his Heisman contention is definitely lowered significantly, and he's maybe in that top 5, maybe top 7.
Oh my God, I forgot to switch it again. I do agree though. I think after that game, especially with the games that Boise State, the running back, why am I blanking on his name right now?
Ashton Jeanty.
Yeah, Ashton Jeanty. After the game that he and Boise State had against Utah State, I think Milroe is pretty much out of the running. I think he might get in that top 5 like by the end of the year, but I don't think he's going to win.
No, yeah. And like Jeanty too, he's played technically 4 games. He's been taken out for 2 second halves so far this season. And just in his game, or just in the season, he's had 95 carries for 1,031 yards. Like, that is absurd. With 16 touchdowns, keep that in mind. He's averaging over 10 yards a carry, which that's crazy. And, like, you don't really see that ever. And, like, the stats he has right now are typical stats that you would see for a full season. And even for the NFL players, too, that's, like, the typical stat, like 1,000 yards, hit or miss. That's where he is. He is definitely up there, and it's between him and Travis Hunter, which we talked about last week, especially with who has the edge. We didn't really bring up Janty's name at all, but he's been the reason why Boise State's ranked 17th right now, and he's definitely up there in the contention for the Heisman winner.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of going back to Travis Hunter, and I guess really Colorado, they're kind of lucky that they had a bye week this week just because – I mean, all the teams that had a bye week this week are really lucky because then they didn't really – because last week it was just so chaotic. Like, to not be a part of the chaos for a week, I'm sure they were like, "Ooh, thank goodness for us." Like,
well, yeah, like they're jumping back into it right now this weekend. I mean, they play Kansas State, and they're 4-1 right now. This is their first ranked matchup, which I think is going to be really interesting to see how it all plays out. And there's been a lot of hype around Colorado because of the big names like Shedeur and Travis Hunter. But this is going to be their first big test. And if they want to have a chance to get ranked, they got to win this game, especially if it's at home. The crowd's going to go crazy. This is their first real test. And they can get themselves to 5-1 and 3-0 in the conference play, which could be huge. And Kansas State, they're going to come out firing. They're 1-1 right now in conference play. But if they want to stay in it, they got to pull this game out. So when I wrote down the top 3 games for this week that will impact the rankings, that was one of them because of just how significant it could impact the Big 12 or just rankings in general. If Colorado wants to make a push in the top 25 or if Kansas State loses, they'll be dropped out of the top 25.
Yeah, I agree. I think that both of those teams need to win that game, and it will shape what the Big 12 is going to look like for the remainder of the year. I think Colorado personally could pull it off, just mainly because Kansas State has not really done too well on the road. I mean, they got pummeled by BYU a few weeks back. And also Colorado, they had hype last year, and I feel like that kind of quickly died down, but it seems like they are rebuilding it slowly but surely. Like, it just seems like they've gotten better and better and better. I don't think that's going to stop with Kansas State. They might sneak into the top 25 with that win, since Kansas State is currently tied with us and Oklahoma at 18th, which, speaking of which, I've never seen a three-way tie on the AP poll before.
Oh, I know.
That's kind of crazy.
And yeah, too.
Yeah.
just what you said about like Kansas State and them playing at home versus away. I also find that really interesting. I mean, like you talked about the loss to BYU, 38-9. Like, that's crazy. And that was before BYU was ranked as well, which is like a significant factor in where Kansas State was ranked during that week. But they also played at Tulane, and they only won by 7. I remember watching that game and how close it really was. And I didn't really know up to that point that Kansas State was legit. But there, it kind of looked a little shaky. I mean, they definitely get a different feel at home versus going somewhere else. I mean, they beat Arizona, who's ranked 20th, 31-7 in week 3. It's a big switch around. I mean, when you go from beating a team by 24 then to lose by 29 at home versus away, there's a big factor and there's a big nervousness there that going to Colorado, facing that atmosphere, their fans go crazy. It's going to get wild in there. And if they can't live up to those expectations and play away, they're going to have a tough time pulling that out.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of Arizona, they play BYU. That's BYU's next game this weekend. I think this could very well be a trap game. Just because, I mean, Arizona has shown that they can contend with like the top teams in the Big 12 after beating Utah. Also, I feel like Arizona, for some reason, they just win against Utah teams.
Yeah.
I don't know why. They just do. So I think this could be a trap game for BYU. Kind of how, like, for IU, I feel like people were saying that Northwestern was going to be a trap game, and it did kind of look like that at the beginning. But I kind of hope, like, for BYU, like, just the run that they've had, I kind of hope that they win. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen BYU ranked this high in football. I mean, 14th is crazy for them.
And, like, just like what you said about Arizona, too. Like, they beat Utah, but then they lose to Texas Tech at home. And obviously, Texas Tech also in the Big 12. And Arizona, they had over 100 votes to get into the AP poll last week. They dropped significantly. They lost so many votes because of that loss. But if they want to rebound there and go to BYU and win, who, like you said, has surprised everyone with how high they're ranked and how they're doing in the Big 12 particularly, then they host Colorado. Those are two big games, and they don't have a bye week in between that. So if they're able to go to BYU and then host Colorado and win there, they got to win at least one if they want to stay in contention to try and get themselves back up into that ranking. 26 was, I think, the highest that they've been all season in terms of how many votes they received. But they got to pull out a win either against BYU or Colorado.
Yeah, I mean, Arizona did beat Colorado last year, but, I mean, they have basically the same team besides the coach. So I think that, I mean, Colorado very well could win that game this year. And also, speaking of Arizona's AP votes, they received none after this weekend, or last weekend. I think the lowest on the list was Kentucky. Colorado still received they received 3 votes, even though they had a bye, which I think is a good sign for them going into this weekend.
And something else that I noticed is that USC has 98. And we talk about USC, Michigan, like the Big Ten. Honestly, I think USC was done a little dirty. I'll explain why. I think losing to a 2-3 Minnesota team, that's very fair, right? They put up a good fight against Michigan, and Michigan did beat USC 27-24. But going from 11 to out of the rankings, I don't know.
It's kind of crazy.
That seems a little too much. And Michigan has a major QB problem, and we can get into that at some point later in the episode. But going from 11th to out of the rankings, I think they should be at least 25. And it's just, I don't see how it's fair that Michigan's still in the top 25. I mean, yes, they beat these teams, but I don't think they deserve to be 24. I mean, they just lost again. Like, that's not a good sign. They're 4-2, and yet they still have almost double the amount of votes as USC has. I don't really know how that makes sense, especially seeing how Washington exposed their QB problems tremendously. They dropped 14 spots while USC dropped over 15 spots.
Yeah, no. In that game against Washington, it seemed like Michigan was playing almost like musical chairs with their quarterbacks and just like switching them in and out until they finally were like, okay, Jackson Tuttle, like, it's on you now. Like, and he was throwing the ball. Like, he didn't look too bad, but at that point, Washington, their defense had them figured out. So it was too late. But yeah, no, I mean, I can see SC moving out of the rankings after that Minnesota loss. They just USC just did not look good in that game. Like, for me, USC's been very up and down this year. So I'm not sure if they really should be in the top 25, but at the same time, like you said, like going from 11 to 26, because I mean they did receive the most votes after 25, so they're essentially like 26. But just being moved out like that is crazy to me. I mean, speaking of teams moving down the rankings a lot, I mean, Missouri goes from number 9, I believe, to number 12 in the AP poll.
21.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, 21. They moved down 12 spots.
Yeah.
They moved down 12 spots, but they moved down to 21 after losing to Texas A&M. I mean, kind of going off that too, I mean, I think the real winner after this weekend was Notre Dame.
Yeah. Because
they had a bye week, and that win against Texas A&M is aging like fine wine right now. I mean, they're within 3 spots of Notre Dame. Like, they're only 3 spots behind them right now, which looks really good for Notre Dame, I think.
Yeah, and just like you said for Missouri, I think they had it coming. I mean, they beat Vandy by 3, who we just talked about. They beat Alabama. Then they only beat Boston College by 6, who were ranked 24 at the time. But when you get blown out to Texas A&M like that, that's a whole different story. I mean, when you're ranked in the top 10 and then lose to 25th ranked team, that doesn't really add up. And I think, too, that for Missouri, they were winning by such narrow margins, and they were relying on that defense because their offense has been very slow to start the season, I think, besides the first 2 games where they blew out both those teams. But Missouri, I think, had it coming. I mean, they were relying too much on that defense and that late game push, but when it got out of hand to the point where they lost by 31, dropping 12 spots, I think that seems a little bit more reasonable over the case that USC was dropped 16 spots.
Yeah, I think actually with the USC drop, I think that might be the biggest drop that we've seen this year so far in the rankings. Missouri definitely is up there. Like, 12 spots is a lot. I think Oklahoma and Oklahoma State moved down the same or maybe 1 spot more last week or the week before. But I think this weekend, I think one of the games that might be a little bit underrated, but we should probably keep an eye on, is the Ole Miss versus LSU game. I feel like that is probably going to fly under a lot of people's radar just because, I mean, Ole Miss lost to Kentucky, and they just haven't really done anything. I mean, their best win is against South Carolina, which is I mean, that's an okay win. I mean, it's a like Power 5 win and everything, but South Carolina is not like top tier SEC or anything. And then LSU, like they haven't really done too much. I mean, their biggest win also is South Carolina. So, and they're 9 and 13th this week.
Yeah, and also I don't want to call it the battle of mid teams, but they're like you said, they are flying under the radar. And that was also a game I had written down as one that will impact the rankings a lot. I mean, you have two teams that are on that line of contender pretender, and there's a lot of people that are hating on how high they're ranked. I said that Ole Miss was a little too high being at 9, especially after still losing to Kentucky like that. But this is going to be a big factor in who's legit and who's not. I mean, LSU, that's a tough place to play. I mean, you see it all the time, not just for football too, like every sport they have. But if Ole Miss is able to go into LSU, get the win, they are going to be known as contenders. I mean,
They're going to be back.
Yeah, they are going to be back. And we talk about how Ole Miss, up to that point against Kentucky, they looked unstoppable. I mean, Ole Miss, they were blowing up opponents. They beat Furman 76-0, and although Furman is Furman, a 76-0 win, that's crazy. And then MTSU 52-3, Wake Forest 40-6, GA Southern 52-13. They're blowing out everyone. And then they just beat South Carolina 27-3. That's not a major blowout, but that's showing that they can still hang in there and just kill people at that point, right? And I think for Ole Miss, if they're able to not do that, but pull out a win at LSU where it's a hard environment, the fans are going to go crazy, they're going to be back, and they are going to be significant contenders in those rankings.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm kind of leaning toward LSU winning this game just because it's at LSU mostly. And, I mean, we've seen how hostile and loud it gets at Tiger Stadium. It's very crazy. But I do think Ole Miss could put up a really good fight. I mean, especially like they beat South Carolina 27-3, which, I mean, South Carolina's offense is pretty solid. I mean, they were going point for point with LSU a couple weeks ago. So I think the key for this game, like for Ole Miss at least, is their defense. They're going to need their defense to get some really big stops, especially early, to kind of show LSU that they're the one, like that it's their game to win, and that LSU is just going to be a step. But I personally think it's going to be a shootout.
Yeah,
this weekend.
And for LSU, I mean, they both have played USC. Ole Miss only allowed 3 points, while LSU allowed 33. If Jackson Dart is able to find holes in LSU's defense, I think that's going to be the deciding factor. I think he's going to be the X factor, and although he's the QB, and obviously he's going to be a big part of the win if they do, I think he's going to be the X factor. I mean, the defense and the points allowed, there's a very big difference in terms of LSU's and Ole Miss's, but if Jackson Dart's able to find the holes in the defense, he's going to be able to keep Ole Miss ahead. It's just a matter of, can LSU solidify those holes and make sure that everything's covered up? And I mean, their defense, they've been a little shaky. I mean, UCLA, they allowed 17 points. And UCLA, we've seen, hasn't been great. I mean, they've played Indiana like we've talked about. Indiana only allowed 13 against them. LSU's got to figure out how they can contain Jackson Dart and how they can contain Harris, because Harris has been a big part of Ole Miss's offense. So if LSU is able to plug up the holes underneath and on those deep routes, they're going to be able to pull out this game. But Jackson Dart has to find a way to go into LSU and win.
100%. 100%. I mean, LSU's defense did kind of show some like flashes against USC at the very beginning of the year. But I think Jackson Dart, like, he's a very experienced QB. I think this is his third year starting or second year?
I think second.
Second. I think he's probably still upperclassman though. Probably junior or senior. So, I mean, he's got a lot of experience there. So I think, especially early on, when the defense is still trying to figure you out, I think that's when Jackson Dart is going to have to he's going to have to make moves and score early before LSU makes any kind of game-changing adjustments that might hinder their ability to win. And also, I mean, speaking of teams that are flying under the radar, I'm looking at the rankings right now. Clemson is at 10. I mean, we were talking about wins aging like fine wine with Notre Dame and Texas A&M. But how about Georgia's win over Clemson at the beginning of the year? I mean, that is looking really good for them now that Clemson is sitting in that 10 spot.
Yeah, and sorry about this, but Jackson Dart, he's a third-year starter. I just looked it up while you were talking.
Okay.
So I was wrong on that. But yeah, no, Clemson at 10 is crazy. I mean, they got an easy schedule coming up too. I mean, their only other ranked opponent is Pitt at 22. I mean, Louisville was up there until they lost, but Clemson's got Wake, Forest, Virginia, and Louisville. And then they go on a 2-game road span at Virginia Tech and Pitt. This is a very doable 11-1 schedule. I mean, they had that loss early to Georgia. Sorry. But besides that, they've had it easy. I mean, the FSU game, that looked a little shaky, 29-13. I would expect a wider margin than that, honestly, because of how they've been doing. But yeah, Clemson, I think, has an easy shot at the ACC here. I mean, the ACC isn't looking as strong. They're the only 3-0 team right now in conference play. Miami, obviously, they're going to be up there at some point. They're going to be a big contender in that. But I think the ACC is starting to form itself, or one of the earliest conferences that are starting to shape themselves as what the championship game can be in a conference. And I think right now we're seeing that in the ACC with Clemson and Miami. But although that can very well change if Clemson loses one of these games.
Yeah, I think part of the reason, like kind of going back to the Clemson win against Florida and them looking shaky, I think it's partially because Florida State finally decided to bench DJU. And so their offense looked a lot different. And it's not like they didn't start an inexperienced quarterback or backup. Like, he played when Jordan Travis got hurt last year. He played in the bowl game against Georgia. So, I mean, he has started before, and he was able to actually score some touchdowns, unlike DJU, for most of the year. I think he might have matched the touchdowns already, because I think Clemson won what, 23-16 or something?
29-13.
29-13. So, yeah. I think also we probably should talk about the Tennessee loss to Arkansas.
Yeah.
Because honestly, I was kind of surprised, especially because of how great Tennessee's offense has looked this year. But they go into Arkansas, and it just looks like their offense just didn't know what to do. They could not figure out Arkansas's defense, and they just froze. And then, I mean, the last play of the game kind of pretty much showed like what the Tennessee just what Tennessee was like the entire game. Like, the quarterback has the ball in the last play. They're like right in range to score that final touchdown, but there was no one open, and the quarterback just runs out of bounds because he doesn't know where to throw the ball or what to do.
Yeah, and I'm going to kind of slide away from that. I'm going to stay on the Tennessee topic, but like you're talking about, 14 points, that's just very different than what they've been doing all season. But now I think the biggest game of the season is going to be Alabama-Tennessee. Both teams are coming off a loss. They don't play this week. They play each other in 2 weeks. But I think this is going to be a win and get in, not as an SEC championship game, but getting into the playoffs.
Yeah.
I mean, for my top 12 or for my playoff projections, it's changed a lot. I don't even have Alabama on mine anymore because of how bad that was. I mean, Vandy 0-60 against top 5 opponents until they played Alabama. But now Tennessee and Alabama, they're 1-1 in conference play. They are very far down, and they got a long way to go. They got to keep up with Georgia. They got to keep up with A&M, who's looked phenomenal. They've looked unbeatable.
Texas.
Yeah, and Texas. How do I even forget Texas? They've only played one conference game. But, yeah, this is going to be the biggest game of the season, I think. I think Texas and Georgia right now, they have the biggest shot of getting into that SEC title game. But for Alabama and Tennessee, whoever wins that game, I think, gets in, and the loser's going home. I think the amount of Big Ten teams that are contending to get into the playoffs, and obviously you have the G5 champion in Boise State, which I think it's not a lock, but they've got a good start on that. this game is going to really determine who can stay in their spot or just move up. I mean, they're both 7 and 8 right now in rankings, respectively, but one of them is going to drop a lot, I think. Even though they're very high, even though they're both top 10 ranked teams, they're going to slide a lot because one, it'll be their second loss of the season, and two, the chance they have of getting into the playoffs after that starts to lower. So I think this is going to be the biggest game of the season. And for Georgia, who lost to Alabama, that loss against Alabama makes it a lot worse for them because just of what Alabama got or what happened to them when they played Vandy.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of that game, if Tennessee was watching the Alabama-Georgia game and even the Vandy-Alabama game, it really seems like Georgia just laid out the blueprint for just for Alabama's defense and how to break them and how to just score over and over and over again. That's kind of like, I'm like doing a huge pivot here, but kind of like with the NFL last year with the Eagles, the 49ers defense just cracked the code on how to stop the Eagles offense. And then the Eagles just lost themselves out of the playoffs that same year. Like, they just did not win a game. Every single NFL defense saw what the 49ers did, and they're like, oh, so that's how you stop them. And then the Eagles just kept losing and losing. And just based on the trend right now with Alabama, I could very well see that happening to them, where they could maybe even get lose to Tennessee. Honestly, South Carolina could be a trap game because, South Carolina has shown that they can score on decent defenses like LSU. So I think that could very well be a trap game for them as well. Alabama's schedule does not get any easier this year. No. So we could very well see a 3 or 4 loss Alabama, and they could get bumped out of the rankings. And the only 2-loss team that's in the rankings right now is Michigan, sitting at 24. So I feel like if you lose 2 games at this point, you're pretty much out.
And also, too, just like you said about Alabama and their schedule, they've still got Tennessee, like we've talked about. They're going there. Then they host Missouri and then go to LSU. Those away games are very tough. And then later, near Thanksgiving, they go to Oklahoma, who's been red hot, too. Those are 3 tough away games. And that loss against Vandy, that's going to hurt them a lot. So the reason why, we'll get into the 12, we'll get into our projections later, but the reason why I don't have them in my top 12 is because just of how many more ranked opponents they have and how hard their schedule has been. But right now, the one thing that is on Alabama's side is they have the biggest win of the season, I think. I think until the Ohio State-Oregon game happens, which is this week, which we can get into that in the Big Ten later, that is the biggest win of the season so far. I think that's gonna be the only thing that's on their side up to this point for the committee to look at. But when they go and play these ranked opponents, they have to win 3 of these games. They have to. If they don't win 3, they have no chance of getting into the playoffs. They'll be at least a 3-loss team. And against conference play, they're not going to be close to that top 3. They're not going to make the game. So they have to win 3 of these games if they want to stay in playoff contention.
Yeah, also kind of going off that too. Georgia is also going to be playing a gauntlet of a schedule. And I think if Georgia loses any of those games, then that win that Alabama has is going to age really bad. Depending on, let's just say Georgia loses to Mississippi State, which is who they play next. That would look really bad for Alabama. And that will probably have them slip down a couple spots, even if they win their game. And also, Alabama, at the end of the year, it's not a ranked game, but they are going to have to play the Iron Bowl against Auburn. And Auburn has given them trouble in the past in the Iron Bowl. So that could be basically a season-ending game right there for Alabama if they lose any of these games leading into the Iron Bowl. And then they lose the Iron Bowl. That's it. Their season's over. They're not going to the SEC championship. They're not going to the playoffs. They might be bowl eligible, but that's it.
Yeah, and I think the only conference right now that you can kind of make a bold prediction on is the ACC. But for the Big Ten and SEC, a lot of the teams have rough schedules. I mean, for Georgia, the SEC has it tremendously worse than the Big Ten does. But Georgia, they have 3 top 10 opponents left. They have Texas going there, and then at Ole Miss. Then they host Tennessee the week right after. It's going to be tough, and they've played 3 ranked or conference games. They're 2-1 right now. They've got to win. They've got to win 2, if not 3. So they got a tough schedule ahead. I don't think it compares to Alabama's, even though their teams are ranked a little lower than Georgia's are. But Georgia's definitely got the tougher opponents. And I feel like that can be an advantage to them, even though they go away, because then when the committee kind of looks at the schedule, looks at the results of who wins what game, they're going to see that Georgia's playing 4 top 10 opponents, because keep in mind, Clemson was higher up at the start of the season. Or no, they were 14. But if they can pull out 2 of these games, especially against Texas, which is a big SEC rival, and they're number 1 right now, that'll be huge. That'll be ginormous if they can win that game.
Also, speaking of Texas, this weekend, Texas also has a big game, and that's the Red River rivalry. Wow, that's a tongue twister. The Red River rivalry at Oklahoma, on the road at Oklahoma. And they lost that game last year. But I think for Texas, if they want to keep all the cards in their hands in the SEC conference, because right now they're undefeated in the SEC. I think they might be the only one undefeated in the SEC. You might have to double check me on that.
Yep.
Yeah. Because of Alabama's loss and pretty much all the top SEC teams lost except for Texas, because Texas was on a bye.
Yep.
But if right now Texas has all the cards in their hand with the SEC title game. Like they're first in the conference, they're undefeated. So I feel like, to me, this is a must win for Texas if they want to keep that number 1 spot, which I don't know if they're going to keep that number 1 spot, because Oklahoma is ranked 18th with IU, like us. And then the game, probably the biggest game of the weekend, Oregon versus Ohio State. You've got the 2 versus the 3. Whoever wins that game is probably going to move up to the number 1 spot, depending on how Texas does against Oklahoma. If Texas wipes the floor with Oklahoma, they'll probably stay, but it's going to be tough. But Texas definitely does need to win if they want to keep control of the SEC and just kind of wrangle the conference for themselves.
And also, too, we can get into the Big Ten, right after this, but for Texas, too, they're on a 5-game homestand. Not many teams this year has a 5-game homestand. And if they lose to Oklahoma in the middle of that homestand, I think they're going to be hit a lot harder than people would think. Not only just because of that, but just because of how, Oklahoma, they're not low, we'll say. But Texas should be able to win. At home, the fans are going to go crazy. They know how important this game is. And after seeing what happened to Alabama, what Georgia has coming up, Texas, they should win this game. But I had them as a 4th game that'll impact rankings. But the one I took over them was Ohio State, Oregon. Obviously, that's going to be the biggest game of the season, I think. At Oregon games are so cool. I love their walkout, with their walkout with the motorcycle. That's so sick. But that's going to determine a lot in the Big Ten. I don't think it'll necessarily impact the AP poll a lot, because the 2 and the 3 team, you're not really going to get punished as much because of how good both the teams are. But in the Big Ten, there's a lot of contention for that game. And IU's still in that. Yeah. And obviously USC drops a lot there. Michigan dropped a lot there. So really, it's kind of between 4 teams right now. You got IU, Penn State, Oregon, and Ohio State. Whoever wins this game, they're going to be pushed up a lot here, because not only are they pushing themselves up, they're dropping the other one down.
Yeah.
So for IU and Penn State, who are just watching this from the side, realistically, they just want someone to lose, right? Because Penn State and IU, they're also both ranked. They're also both lower than them. And I think throughout the season, they're not really going to get above them except Penn State, maybe, depending on how low they drop the loser of Oregon or Ohio State. But this is going to determine a lot in the Big Ten. And right now, IU, we can get into that too. IU doesn't have really a tough schedule up until they face Michigan and Ohio State in back-to-back weeks later in the season.
And I mean, after that Michigan game, I'm sure IU probably is also going to be looking at Washington as well. Because, I mean, just after watching that game, Washington looks like they play really smart. And that could be a sneaky game for IU. I mean, I think we'll probably still win. I think our offense will be a little bit too much for Washington to handle because we can, unlike Michigan, we can throw and run the ball at the same time. So, but yeah, I think with this game with Ohio State and Oregon, that is really going to determine who is going to be in the Big Ten championship. For me, I think this is a must win for Oregon, at least like in their case, because I mean, Ohio State is probably going to make it there one way or another. I mean, I think they're going to take a one-loss Ohio State over like maybe like one-loss Penn State or like any other team. But I think at least in the case of IU, I think we want to see Ohio State win just because we play them on our schedule. And if that's going to be our one loss, then I think that is going to like increase our chances of being able to get a rematch against them in the Big Ten championship later this year.
And Ohio State goes to Penn State for their first game in November. Like, that's going to be a whiteout. That goes crazy. Like, I have people that I know that go there, and they know how electric that atmosphere is. I think this could be the year that Penn State pulls it off.
I agree.
I mean, there's a lot of jokes going on that, like, oh, Penn State, Ohio State. Oh, who wins? Oh, Ohio State every time. I think Penn State could pull it off this year. I mean, I've been very hesitant on Penn State. I think at some point in the season, they always drop off one way or another. I don't know. After last week, I think Penn State has a solid chance. I mean, they're fourth right now. Do I think that's a little high?
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, they beat UCLA, 27-11? That's not a good win, to say the least. I mean, IU beat them a lot worse than what Penn State did.
And Oregon.
And Oregon, yeah. So for Penn State, they play USC. They go to USC. And although USC isn't ranked, this is their chance to get back up into those rankings. And for Penn State, if they want to stay in that top 5, they have to go and win. I mean, their only ranked team that they play is Ohio State for the rest of the season. They have it all drawn out for them. They have to go to USC and win. Then they go to Wisconsin and win. Then they host Ohio State. There's a solid chance they win that. And if they win against Ohio State, I think the rest of their schedule's all wins because they have Washington, Purdue, Minnesota, Maryland. And obviously Minnesota, they've been very sneaky with how they've been playing teams like USC and Michigan. But Penn State has a solid chance. And if Penn State's able to pull it out at home in a whiteout against Ohio State, they are going to be in that national championship favorite position. I mean, close to it, depending on how everything else shakes out. But Penn State's going to be up there.
Yeah, Penn State just cannot afford to take their foot off the gas. I mean, they haven't really scored like against like ranked opponents like Illinois, because that's the only ranked team they've played this year. But like, I guess against any other high end opponents, they haven't really scored a lot, but they have also been keeping their opponents from scoring. Like, they've done a really good job defensively on keeping their opponents from scoring, which I think is good for their offense because, like, I mean, this is Drew Aller's second year. He's true sophomore. Like, I feel like that takes a lot of the pressure off of him, and he's able to actually like play the way that they know he can play, like to the best of his ability. But I think a Penn State win over Ohio State would be huge for IU. Because I mean, I feel like it might crush Ohio State's morale just because they've beaten Penn State so many times in a row. But like IU would see Ohio State lose to Penn State, and that makes Ohio State look a lot less invincible than they've looked this year, I think. I mean, Ohio State, like, I mean, they have their own version of Ryan Williams on their team. And like, there's been this whole debate on which one of them is really better or has more of an impact. But I mean, with the Ohio State schedule this year, they could very well just not make the Big Ten championship. I mean, I think they still probably will make the playoffs, even if they don't make the championship, just based on the way some of these other teams below them have been playing, like Miami. Miami's had 2 very close games the past couple weeks that has come down to a couple calls. That's kind of controversial, but I mean, I think in the game against Virginia Tech, I think that was probably the right call. With the incomplete pass, he didn't have control of it. I don't know if there was enough to overturn it, but I do think that that's what the call should have been. And then, of course, against Cal, they had a huge last-minute comeback. They had like almost 300 yards in the fourth quarter alone to come back against Cal. But at the very beginning of that game, Miami looked really shaky. So I think if any of these other teams like keep giving off scares, take a like strange loss, Ohio State is probably still going to be in that top 12 and make the playoff, I think.
And from an IU perspective, they're 6-0 for the first time since 1967, which is like great for us. But now they get a very deserved bye week, which is very important, I think, to them, because then they host Nebraska and then Washington. Those are going to be 2 games that they have to win. Nebraska, they've been getting a lot more votes recently. They're 27th in the AP poll with the rankings or with the points and how that's shaken out.
Oh, right behind USC.
Yep. And if they lose one of those 2 games, they're going to be sliding down a lot. But I think getting a bye week this week and letting all the other teams play, it kind of gives them a chance to move up without having to do anything. Like we talked about Notre Dame, they had a bye week, they moved up 3 spots, which helped them a lot. I think that can happen to Indiana as well. Do I think we could beat Nebraska and Washington? Yes, because they're both at home.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and going to Washington is very different than being at home. Washington has a crazy atmosphere, and I think Michigan, they experienced that with how they played against them. But for IU, they played great against Northwestern. I mean, it looked a little shaky. I mean, I was at the game. That game, it was electric. I'm not going to lie. Going to Northwestern, I wouldn't have expected it to be as hype as it was. I mean, I will say, too, it's very windy because the stadium, it's being renovated, and so they're on, like, a new, like, practice field type
It's right
thing.
on the lake.
It's right on the lake. You can see Chicago in the back. It's so windy. But Rourke was able to still throw for 380 and 3 touchdowns. There's not much that could really stop him in the offense, and they've had 500-plus total yards of offense in 4 games now, which is absurd. And they went 7 for 7 on red zone trips, and that pushes them to 3-0 in conference play, which is the first team and bowl eligible. The first team to go bowl eligible, 6-0 in the season.
I think us and Miami are the 2 teams right now that are bowl eligible. I mean, we obviously got it before Miami, but Miami was that next team that's bowl eligible because all the other teams like Ohio State, Texas, Oregon, Penn State, like those top teams, like those guys had a bye week pretty early on, and then you've got some of the other top teams like Alabama and Tennessee and Clemson who also had a bye week early on, but they also took a loss as well. So they just haven't been able to get bowl eligible. But that just means that they're daunted,
Yeah. And I think going back to the rankings, like I remember because I think this is very important. Like I think you mentioned how Indiana has a chance to get into the teen range for rankings. I think that's still very much in the picture. I think with the way their schedule is laid out ahead of them, besides Michigan and Ohio State, I think they can go 11-1. I think it's very possible. Is it going to happen? We don't know. I mean, obviously we don't know, but
we don't have a crystal ball.
Yeah, but it's just the teams they play, it's just they're so hit or miss because Raiola and Nebraska, they won 14-7 against Rutgers, which not a really defying win to say the least, but they did beat Colorado 28-10 and then only lose to Illinois by 7, which at the time they were ranked 24th, which is a ranked team. So Nebraska was able to keep up with them.
And I think they played Purdue last week, if I remember right, didn't they?
Yes, they won 28-10 there.
They had a pretty shaky start though.
Yeah, they did. And yeah, they didn't really pull. No points were scored in that first half. They scored 21 in the fourth, which is crazy. But yeah, it's going to be tough for Nebraska to come in here and beat IU. I think Raiola as a freshman versus Rourke as a senior, there's obviously a lot more experience on IU's side, and they're hosting Nebraska. So that'll be very interesting to look at. And then they go to Ohio State, which is back-to-back road-ranked games in conference. So that's going to be tough for Nebraska. And I think if they want to get ranked and they know what's on the line here against both these teams, they've got to pull out one of these games if they want to slide themselves up. They have 51 votes, which is second outside the top 25, just behind USC, which we've talked about already. But it's going to be a tough game for Nebraska. And I think there's going to be a lot of pressure for Coach Signetti to pull this game out. I mean, he's been hyping up his team, and I think he's done a phenomenal job. But this is going to be his biggest test. We've talked about how UCLA through 3 weeks were their biggest test, then Maryland through 5 weeks. Now it's going to be Nebraska through 7. I feel like every other week there's always some sort of change in what their biggest win is. And I think as the season goes on, the wins are going to be harder to get because of how their schedule is laid out. I mean, they play the easier teams earlier in the season, then they face the harder teams except Purdue at the very end of the season, which we will win. But yeah, it just gets harder as the season goes on. So I think the games that they played down the stretch are going to be a lot more important for IU. And if they're able to pull out wins against Nebraska, Washington, and Michigan State up until they face Michigan at home, this is going to be good for IU.
I agree. I think kind of going back to the home field advantage that we're going to have against Nebraska, I think it's going to be a lot bigger than people think because as each week has gone by for us, we just get more and more and more and more hyped about our football team because we keep winning. And now we're going to have a bye week coming up. So we're all going to be like, we all get like a nice little week off. And then we're going into homecoming weekend, noon Saturday. We're going to be ready for that game for sure. Like it's going to be, I think it could very well be sold out stadium that day. Because I think this is definitely going to be the biggest home game that we've had so far this year. Having a team because Nebraska was ranked previously this year. I mean, there was a point where Nebraska was going to be our first ranked opponent of the year, but then they fell to Illinois, and then they've been booted out of the rankings since then. But Nebraska is still going to be because like you said, this is the biggest test that IU is going to have up until this week. And I think that is just going to get our fan base even more excited to go to that game, pack the house, or I should say pack the rock because that's the stadium.
Yep.
And show out. And hopefully we get that win. The only thing though is after bye week sometimes because we've been on a roll, we've been having a really good rhythm. Sometimes teams they come out of the bye week and they lose that. I hope that doesn't happen to us. I don't think it will. I don't think Signetti will let that happen.
No.
But it does happen to some teams. So I think that is also going to be something to watch out for as well.
And earlier in the season, too, Raiola and Rourke were step for step in stats. Rourke has now kind of pulled away and showed his experienced side over Raiola. I mean, he's got 14 touchdowns on two interceptions only. That's a good ratio. He's also got 1,700 yards passing, which is crazy. I mean, you wouldn't really expect that from a transfer coming out of OU like that. And for Rourke, he's stepped in and filled in his role great. And I mean, it's not like he's played every snap of the season too. He's had to come out of the game because of how bad they've been blowing out teams. When they played Western Illinois, when they played Charlotte, they've had Trace Jackson Davis come in and him takes a few snaps, or Tyler Cherry, he's come in as well. But for Rourke to be able to kind of pull away and show his experienced side, it kind of gives IU fans and the committee a lot more trust in IU that he's able to lead the team. And one player that we haven't mentioned yet is also Aiden Fisher. Because, I mean, Aiden Fisher, he's been phenomenal on the defensive side as well. He's stepped up big time. He's one of their best tacklers, one of the best pass rushers. He's like the Micah Parsons of Indiana. I mean, Micah Parsons for the Cowboys, he could do everything on defense. Aiden Fisher, he's kind of like that type of player, but for IU. And if he's able to play the way he's been playing, IU's going to have a big chance to win this game. And if IU's defense, besides Aiden Fisher, like the DBs and the safeties, if they're able to lock up Nair and all these other wide receivers that Nebraska has, they're going to be in a good position to win, especially if they're only scoring 14 points against Rutgers, who has been solid, but obviously they haven't been talked about as much in the Big Ten. But if they're able to only put up 14 points against Rutgers, I think IU's got a really good shot of winning this game in 2 weeks.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think to conclude, we should do our 12-team playoffs. I mean, we've kind of already touched on them a little bit.
Yeah.
I did a little bit of switching. I mean, I obviously had to move Bama out of the number 1 spot because that's where I had them last week. But otherwise, I didn't really have to change too much with my top 4. I pretty much just moved Texas up in the number 1 spot. I pretty much have like the 1 spot designated for the SEC team, the 2 spot for the Big Ten, 3 for ACC, 4 for Big 12, just as the conference champions. So I've got Texas at 1, Ohio State at 2, Miami at 3, and BYU at 4. So my 2, 3, and 4 are going to stay the same just because they haven't given me really too much of a reason to move them up. I mean, you could argue switching Miami and Clemson, like for Clemson right now, just because of how Clemson has looked, but I'm still going to keep Miami in that spot. At number 5, I have Oregon this time, and at 6, I have Penn State. So I moved both those guys up 1 spot. I moved Bama down to the 7 spot because I still don't think I should put them above Georgia just yet. So I have Georgia at 8. Clemson, I moved up to 9. Last week, I had them at the 11 spot. I moved Iowa State up to 10, and then Indiana down to 11, just because I liked the way Iowa State looked in their game a little bit, so I wanted to reward them. And I still have Boise State at 12, but I feel like for the 12 spot, you could even like consider putting in Army and Navy because they are still undefeated, and they look pretty solid. I'm not gonna lie. So I feel
they're
like
neck and neck together.
Yeah.
So for mine changed a lot. I mean, I'll be honest, it definitely changed a lot. I have Ohio State at my 1, Texas at 2 for Big Ten and SEC. Then Miami and BYU as my ACC and Big 12. I had Kansas State originally, but I don't really know how they're going to shape out, and I think BYU has just been more consistent throughout the season so far, so that's why I kind of kept them there. I also have Oregon at 5 like you did. I have Georgia at 6. And then Penn State at 7, Clemson at 8, Iowa State at 9, and then I have Tennessee at 10. I think either Tennessee or Alabama could fill in that spot. I think it's just whoever wins, because I said it earlier that the Tennessee-Alabama game, that's just going to be a win and get in type thing, in my opinion. But I think that's going to be the biggest game of the season up to that point because of what they had against Vandy and Arkansas this week. And then I have Oklahoma at 11, and then Boise State as the G5 champion at 12. So I think a lot of mine definitely changed, but obviously we're only through 6 weeks, so anything can happen. We're only halfway through the season, so this is definitely going to look very different by the time 12 weeks is done before the actual top 12 comes out.
Yeah. I mean, we've already talked about how so many things can change within the next, even just like 2 weeks or even just this weekend. Like, especially with the Red River rivalry game, the Ohio State Oregon game, the USC Penn State game. Those are definitely, I think, the top 3 games. And then, of course, the Ole Miss LSU game. Like, there's just so much that can change after this weekend. So I'm just really excited to see all of that play out because I feel like you can have a prediction in college football and it could sound so ever so reasonable, and then
Next week comes and it's all gone.
Yeah, the unthinkable happens, and then everything is just completely flipped on its head. So,
and I think too that as an IU fan, I think it's going to be a nice breather that they can just watch from the sidelines this week, see how everything plays out. And I think for my rankings next week, I think the winner of Ohio State or Oregon will be the number one. I think if Oregon wins, they're going to take the one, and Ohio State will drop. I got to figure out where because of how everything else is going to play out. But I think it's going to be good I think in my opinion at least, that IU gets a break and we get to watch how everything else plays out while IU's still undefeated.
yeah.
And hopefully the results will be in IU's favor to the point where they get raised in the rankings without having to do anything like what happened to Notre Dame this week.
Yeah. I mean, we just need certain teams to lose in that top spot. Like, I mean, there's going to be some games where it's like Clemson is probably not going to lose to Wake Forest. I mean, that like Wake Forest is probably in a worse status than Vanderbilt is in the SEC. I mean, Clemson, and just the way Clemson's been playing, I really don't see them losing that game. Iowa State, though, we haven't really talked about it, but I think this West Virginia game could be a trap game for Iowa State. It's at West Virginia, and I know West Virginia lost to Iowa State last year in pretty interesting and not good fashion on their side. So I think West Virginia could very well come out for revenge. We'll see, though. I think that is one game I think that could play out in IU's favor if West Virginia was to win that game.
And both teams are 2-0 in conference play in the Big 12, so that's going to have major implications there. And Iowa State, obviously, like we haven't really talked about it much, and neither has the committee. I mean, I feel like all the teams that have been named or that have been talked about, Iowa State's not one of them, and they're almost in the top 10. They're like right on the edge of it. But like you said, West Virginia, they beat Oklahoma State 38-14, who was once a ranked team. And then they only lost to Pitt, who is now ranked 38-34. So
yeah,
they're staying with them, and it's at West Virginia. So I think the chances, I think it's still in Iowa State's favor, but West Virginia, like you said, it could be a trap game.
Yeah, I mean, especially after last week, there's just so many trap games. So, like just anything could happen with that. And I mean, speaking of Oklahoma State, I mean, they were at one point a contender for the Big 12 championship game, like at the beginning of the year. There was a lot of chatter around Oklahoma State, and now they're gone. They're just gone. So
I think a lot of the Big 12 has also stepped up. I mean, like we talked about BYU, they were like kind of on the edge, and then now look, they're 5-0, and they're gonna try and play for that 4th spot, I think, into the Big 12. And then obviously Kansas State's still up there. Texas Tech, they're making a name for themselves up there too.
Yeah.
But it's just all going to depend on how everything else plays out. I mean, can Oklahoma State get back in it? Yes. Is it likely? Probably not.
Yeah.
So it all just depends on how everything plays out. I mean, we're halfway through the season. I think everything has kind of played out the way we thought it would have. I think the biggest surprise teams that have come up are the reigning national champions in Michigan, who are at 24, and how they've played. IU, no one ever thought they were going to be 6-0 and the first team that was bowl eligible. And then Iowa State, they're 11th, so they've been playing outstanding. But I think the top 5 has kind of stayed the same, with the Big Ten teams being the Big Ten teams, the SEC teams being the SEC teams. But everything else, it kind of looks like it's staying the same. But there's been a couple surprises halfway through the season, and I'm curious to see how that kind of transpires for the rest, especially for IU and how they perform against the harder matchups that they have in October and November.
Yeah, our schedule kind of is nice because the way it's split up, because it's like we got kind of the easier opponents like starting off, and then we get a nice little break, and then we get to like watch these other teams play, and then we go into our gauntlet. But that is all we have for today. We're out of time. We'll see you guys next week with who knows what we're even going to be talking about.
We don't know.
Yeah, we really don't know. For all we know, we could be going crazy about the Notre Dame-Stanford game, which Notre Dame probably should win, but Stanford has not looked too bad this year, speaking of trap games. So, yeah.
It's college football. Anything can happen.
Anything can happen. So, yeah, we can't like tell you the exact thing we're gonna be talking about next week, but expect something big. All right.